for today's book is called As to Where He'd Want. And I'm back of self-sabotage. Hey guys, welcome to BookBabeBeauty. My name is Erica and I love books and makeup. I especially love to give you guys a review on an amazing book that I just read while I do my makeup. Guys, this book, it was so unique. It is another romance novel, but it is so much more than that. This tragic love story was definitely heartbreaking at times. Actually, it was heartbreaking a lot of the time. The adversity that the lead male character dealt with in this story is definitely unlike anything I've ever read before. I know I say that a lot, but I'm serious this time. This romance novel falls more in line with a romantic suspense or a romantic thriller novel, with a touch of some dark elements. So, for that reason, I feel like I should apply some warnings here. Because, first and foremost, the main element in this story is kidnapping. Some of the elements in this book also include issues of childhood abuse, especially of an extreme form. It also includes a violent attack on a female character. I always like to be transparent with warnings like this because oftentimes just the mention of some of these themes within a story are enough to trigger a reader themselves. But this story is much more than just the painful events surrounding these dark elements, because it's more about how the characters overcame the heartache that these tragedies caused. This story inspires strength, courage, and forgiveness of the highest degree. This book was truly everything, and I am so pleased to say yet again that this book was from another new-to-me author. Although books from authors that I know and love are always being read by me, it really is my goal to experience the writing of as many talented authors as I can, so that I may introduce anyone watching my videos to read the works of authors that they may not have heard of otherwise. So today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this story, what you can expect if you decide to pick this book up, a little bit about the characters in this book, as well as a little about the author who wrote it. So without further ado, let me introduce the novel featured in today's video. Today's book is called Lotus by Jennifer Hartmann. It's a short title with an incredibly powerful meaning and an absolutely ingenious revelation. I actually still get chills when I think about it, because this story was brilliantly written. Now that I've said all that, I am ready to put my makeup on, so let's get started. This story starts off in the narrative of someone you don't know yet, but will come to know very well. At first, there's clearly confusion within this character, as they are frantically stumbling around in a hazmat suit, and onlookers are equally as confused at what they're seeing. A hazmat suit is not everyday attire. In fact, seeing a person in one would be cause for concern. But this character is concerned why the onlookers, hanging out of their car windows laughing, aren't wearing a hazmat suit of their own. Panic ensues as he tries to make sense of what's going on. The air should be toxic to breathe. So then why are all of these people breathing the toxic air? with anxiety crushing him and feeling like he can barely breathe himself while in the suit he's wearing, he strips off his mask, sure that he's just made a fatal mistake. Then everything goes dark. Suddenly, the reader is thrown into the first-person narrative of the female lead character named Sydney. Everything seems normal in Sydney's world, other than the fact that her neighbor is convinced that Sydney is a sinful trollop, whose life goal is to give her neighbor a heart attack with her revealing choice of clothing. And it didn't really help her cause that while fetching the mail, Sydney slipped on some ice, thus causing a wardrobe malfunction. Just another beautiful day in the neighborhood. At least Sydney's best friend and childhood buddy Gabe lived next door. He was her saving grace from the nosy neighbor currently chanting Hail Marys after the eyeful of boob she'd just been presented. Sydney had bought her childhood home from her parents, while Gabe had inherited the house next door from his dad. Both grew up as neighbors, and neighbors they remained. But one person who'd used to reside there no longer did. That was a touchy subject that didn't get brought up often. Oliver was Gabe's stepbrother. Gabe's dad had since remarried, but used to be married to Oliver's mom. However, Oliver had disappeared July 4th of 1998, never to be seen again. 22 years had gone by with no signs as to where he went. At this point, it was anybody's guess, but after all this time, he likely wasn't among the living. Oliver was at one time not only Sydney's neighbor, but also her first best friend. Their days were often spent together, and from their perspective, they'd have many more to come. But when Oliver vanished without a trace, Sydney had kind of just fell apart emotionally. It was a traumatic experience for everyone involved. Without any idea of what happened to him, there hadn't been any closure for anyone who'd loved him. In the present time, the only connection that she still had to Oliver was Gabe, of course, but also the painting she created of what Oliver would look like. Had he aged the 22 years, he should have. See, Sydney was an artist. Her days were spent in graphic artistry, designing websites from her home, while in her free time, she would apply that creative energy into painting. To her, painting was therapeutic, and she'd get lost in the brushstrokes while she listened to her favorite 90s grunge bands. A girl after my own heart. Her social energy was pretty much limited to her sister Clementine and, well, of course, Gabe, which was strictly platonic. And, well, Sydney was perfectly content with that. Obviously, she'd had a very healthy sexual appetite, but relationships were just not something Sydney was interested in. One-night stands were more her speed. On a night like any other, where the plan was for Gabe to come over and binge on junk food and Always Sunny episodes, she'd found it odd when he didn't show up. Assuming he'd ditched her for a hookup, she had no idea that the real reason would cause her entire world to crumble around her. Because he'd been found. 22 years later, Oliver was alive, and he was currently undergoing examination at a hospital. Sydney's mind was flooded with a mix of emotions. Of course she was elated and most especially relieved that her best friend was still walking this planet after 22 years of thinking he was dead. But then that brought about the confusion and the terror from all of the thoughts now that plagued her about where he'd been all this time. And most terrifying was the question, what had he been through? What had he seen? Upon arriving at the hospital, Oliver wasn't saying much, as he seemed to be in a state of shock and confusion himself. and it would be a long while before detectives and the people who'd once been close to him would discover the terrifying truth from all those missing years. I'm at a stopping point, so I'm going to go ahead and put my eyebrows on off camera, and when I come back, I'll talk a little bit more about this story. I will be right back. I'm back, so let's get back to the story. At this point, the story is being told in the narrative of both Sydney and Oliver. And what you should understand as a reader is that Oliver's rebirth into the current world is much like Brendan Fraser's was in the movie Blast from the Past, because Oliver had been held in captivity for the last 22 years that he'd been missing. In fact, he'd been kept in an underground bunker of sorts by a man whom Oliver only knew as Bradford. No one knew who Bradford was or why he'd kept Oliver hidden from the world. Until this point, Oliver had only known Bradford as the man who had kept him safe from the toxic air that had apparently destroyed the earth. Obviously, he discovered now, at this point, that was a lie. He just couldn't understand why he was told that lie. And detectives could only speculate the most sinister reason. However, Oliver had been adamant that Bradford had never done anything inappropriate to him while in his care. In fact, Oliver had grown rather fond of the man, whose intentions for the last 2 decades had only been to keep Oliver safe. But having missed over 2 decades of a world that continued to live and make advances in technology, had social interactions, he realized he had a lot of catching up to do. The world that he knew before he vanished was void of cell phones, internet, and flat screen TVs with Netflix. The only social interactions that he'd had in those 2 decades had been with Bradford. Oliver had been allowed to read books and watch a handful of old movies, but that hadn't been enough to prepare him for the social world of today, where slang and acronyms seemed to be the new language. One could only fathom how Oliver had mentally survived the isolation for so long. Almost a quarter of a century was spent in captivity, with no connection emotionally or physically with humankind. But captivity is where Oliver made friends with his creativity, because very early on, as he realized the days ran together and the years ticked by, he started drawing comics. In these comics, Oliver had depicted himself as the hero, who'd been consistently in the habit of saving a girl who resembled Sydney. However, he didn't realize it at the time. Sydney had just been a familiar face from his formative memories, because as time passed by while in captivity, he'd lost sight of the life he once had before the bunker became his home. The bond that Sydney had with Oliver vanished when he did all those years ago. So when they were reunited, they were basically 2 strangers with the memories of their childhood long forgotten by Oliver. However, Sydney hadn't forgotten, and Oliver's inability to remember those childhood years was painful for her and frustrating for him. But when the mind is going through trauma, oftentimes the brain suppresses as a way to protect. But of all that he had forgotten, there was something about Sydney that triggered some memories to life. Perhaps because he'd associated the little girl from the comics with the grown woman standing before him. In the early days after Oliver's return, He'd moved in next door with Gabe, and Sydney tried very cautiously to connect with him. At first, Oliver wasn't much for talking, as he felt like an outsider in a world that had continued to grow and prosper without him. But Sydney seemed to be the only one that Oliver felt keen on opening up to. Aside from his quirks, having not had normal social exchanges in almost a quarter century, Sydney discovered that Oliver was incredibly smart. Of course, Oliver had read so many books while in captivity, so he was aware how things worked. He was also aware from the stories he read and the movies he watched of the different emotions that people could have, but he just hadn't yet experienced the majority of them. He had a hard time understanding social cues, and it was as if he possessed the social finesse of a caveman, having been locked away for so long. But Sydney and Oliver soon discovered that the connection they had as young children hadn't been lost. There was still an underlying bond between the two of them that seemed to grow as the days went by. And since they were neighbors again, it allowed them a lot of opportunity to see each other. Despite the years lost between them, there was an undeniable attraction to one another. But Sydney was very hesitant to act on that attraction because she'd already lost her best friend once, and she didn't want to lose him again. Her expertise definitely wasn't in keeping a relationship. It was in pushing people away and keeping them at arm's length. But Oliver found it incredibly hard to resist his feelings for Sydney, and he had no interest in pursuing other women. But Sydney realized that without romantic experience, it would be harder for Oliver to make a romantic connection with someone else. So, in a knee-jerk attempt at throwing caution to the wind, and also helping Oliver experience some of his firsts, Sydney allowed for a more physical approach in their relationship. But it was at that point that there was no turning back for them. Sydney and Oliver's relationship was definitely of the slow burn variety. Partially because Sydney knew that she had a habit of self-sabotage in a relationship, and she was trying to protect Oliver from it. He, however, couldn't understand why she wouldn't just trust him to protect himself. Everyone seemed to treat Oliver with kid gloves and worried over whether he'd emotionally fall apart. But Sydney, at the time, didn't realize in testing the waters of a relationship with Oliver, even if it was just in fear of losing him, would inevitably push him away regardless, because it hurt Oliver too much to see her with other men. I'm at a stopping point, so I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of my makeup on off camera, and when I come back, I will discuss my final thoughts and opinions about this story, as well as a little information about the author who wrote it. So, I will be right back. I'm back, and my makeup is done. Now, let's get back to the story. The relationship between Sydney and Oliver was so unique in that Oliver had gone through something that was so difficult for people to wrap their heads around. The fact that he still had the ability to have a positive outlook on life was baffling. But he was more concerned with trying to appreciate the time that he lost by enjoying life as it came. And instead of worrying about the what ifs in the future, it was important for him to live in the present. The characters in this story were met with many hurdles even after Oliver had been found. And those hurdles included the truth behind why Oliver had been taken in the first place. they'd come to realize that the truth had been glaring them right in the face all along. But they were missing some crucial pieces to the puzzle that they were trying to put together. And Sydney also realized why she had such deep-rooted issues surrounding committed relationships. The timeline of events throughout the story was illustrated so well that it all felt like a believable experience. I think this story was so unique in that it touched on some topics that are often difficult to fictionalize. But what I noticed that was so important was that the author concentrated their efforts surrounding these topics in shining a light on the strength and ability of the characters to adapt and overcome, rather than allowing those dark events to weaken them. Each character played a crucial role in introducing Oliver back into the world, and likewise, Oliver seemed to be a crucial component in helping everyone heal after the traumatic incident, even though he lacked a lot of social skills that he lost after so much time away. The author of this book, Jennifer Hartmann, is a best-selling author of contemporary and dark romance. I believe she's published 6 books now, with a couple of new releases coming soon. And if I'm not mistaken, I think she's pretty new in her writing career, as it looks like her earliest release was in 2020. I definitely want to read her other work because this was yet again another author who's blown me away. And I'm always incredibly amazed at how much talent there is in this world. This book is available on Kindle Unlimited, so if you have a KU subscription, you can read this book for free. I always say this, but Kindle Unlimited is such a great way for readers to experience the work of new-to-them authors without risk. With Kindle Unlimited, if you don't like a book, you can just return it and get another one, and you haven't lost any money. It's also a great way for authors to get exposure, even in the smallest form. If you've read this book, leave me a comment and let me know. I'd love to hear what you thought about it. And if you haven't read this book, be sure to check in my description box below for a link where you can find this book on Amazon. If you have any book suggestions for me, please feel free to let me know. And if you're an author and you want me to read your book, check out my website. The address is listed in the description box as well, and fill out a form. You never know, you could see your book in a future video. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you like books and makeup, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for your time and for your support. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Y'all stay safe out there, read a damn book, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.